a family friend even advised me that why don't you go and take up a packing job at a warehouse, for survival. And I have no disrespect for packing jobs at the warehouse, just that my skills and training is not good. I'd be the worst packer in the world if I had taken that job, right?
Welcome to Business of Inclusion, a podcast by TRIEC. Who's TRIEC? We're the Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council. What does that mean? We work to champion the skills and talents of newcomers and build immigrant-inclusive workplaces, because we believe when immigrants prosper, the region prospers. On the pod, we'll bring you topics that affect the region's employers and its increasingly diverse workforce.
Hi, podcast listeners. I'm Raj Dam, and I'll be your host for this episode of Business of Inclusion. Today, we are sitting down with economist Anita Shinde, a senior manager at Deloitte and founding member of their economic advisory practice here in Canada. Anita has headed up a range of economic research projects on topics ranging from healthcare to sports to tourism. We have asked her here to discuss a recent report from Deloitte titled Uncovering Underemployment, Tapping into the Potential of Our Workforce. The report looks at causes and impact as well as the collective action needed to tackle underemployment. We are very pleased to have Anita in the studio to tell us more. First of all, sincere compliments for bringing out this white paper that is aptly titled Uncovering Underemployment. I think this is very relevant for the times we live in. Congratulations to you and your team.
Thank you so much. Very happy to have been part of this important study. It was a collaboration between Deloitte and the Greater Toronto Airport Authority. Collectively, we were both interested in understanding more about this important topic of underemployment, particularly in the Greater Toronto area.
As you might be aware, TRIEC has been at the forefront of combating underemployment in the GTA for the last 15 years. We have helped more than 20,000 newcomers integrate themselves in the Canadian job market or the labor market through various programs of ours. Now, we know that the general definition of underemployment is that if somebody is holding a job that is not a match to their skills and experience. But in your research, for the first time I heard about this very interesting concept of visible underemployment and invisible underemployment. So could you take us through that a little bit?
So underemployment, as you've alluded to, is one of those topics that's not widely studied. There's not a great deal of research or literature on it yet, which is all the more reason we need to study it further. There are a few sources that do speak about this concept of visible and invisible underemployment, which shed a little bit of light on it further. Visible underemployment broadly relates to this capacity within the workforce that we're not tapping into, particularly from a timing perspective. So individuals may be engaged in part-time work, but they are actually interested and capable, able to work full-time. They just happen to have been able to find those part-time roles. Invisible underemployment relates to this capacity in the workforce that we're not tapping into from a capability perspective. So it may be individuals that have education, work experience, or other credentials that are not fully being leveraged in their existing roles. And collectively, these both relate to us not tapping into a portion of the workforce to its full potential.
Got it. I just wanted to ask you a little more on the part-time role. What do you think in your research, what was the reasons for somebody to choose part-time roles? Was it out of their individual choice, or was it because they were not finding a full-time role that was commensurate to their experience?
Yeah, I think it's both. It certainly is case by case in terms of why somebody would be engaged in part-time. They may have barriers to why they can't work full-time. For example, people who have children and maybe there's challenges around childcare costs and covering that aspect of it. There may be transportation costs to consider. Depending on where you fall in the demographic sort of socioeconomic background, you may have things that are prohibiting you from working full-time. But certainly it may also be a case of that's the job you've been able to find, and you do need something to sort of help, carry you through as you continue to look for full-time work. So there certainly could be both cases, yeah.
Got it. When it comes to underemployment, we know that numerous groups are more at disadvantage than others, and some of these groups could include, racial and ethnic minorities, newcomers to Canada, women, and then, of course, indigenous peoples, and so on. Now, what do you think are some of the shared barriers among these groups that could prevent them from finding gainful employment?
There are, as you said, very much a range of individuals that can experience underemployment. I think within those, we identified 8 segments, but there's certainly may be more within the population that are having challenges accessing employment for various types of demographic, socioeconomic, perhaps geographical reasons. Generally and broadly, these limitations make it challenging to find gainful employment in the way in which you may want to, whether it's full-time work, or to leverage those skills, credentials that you have. There are specific barriers that different groups face specifically. Low-income earners is one of the groups we mentioned, who may face some of those cost barriers to access employment, whether it's transportation, the childcare costs, for example. You mentioned women, which historically we do see in the data have worked more part-time. They have tended to take on family responsibilities, and that may lead them to some part-time opportunities or things like that on a historical basis. So there's various types of limitations. I think there's biases sometimes that are faced in the workplace, conscious or unconscious. And that really could apply, I think, broadly to your question, to all of these groups in some form or another, which may relate to accessing that employment opportunity, but even also growing successfully within that role. I think this is a very complex topic that has various layers to it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I just want to point out an interesting thing that you just said, that there could be biases, conscious or unconscious, in the industry. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think something that we found in our research, and certainly people self-report, or many of those community organizations, employment agencies, such as yourself, would tell us that individuals face various forms of biases in the workplace. And that may happen at the interview stage. It may happen while you're in a particular role. It may relate to how you interact with your workplace. There may be language considerations, soft skill considerations, backgrounds of the individuals in a particular workplace, and how they think about broadening their teams or growing people within the team. I think there's various forms of biases that tend to be self-reported in that regard, which certainly would impact somebody's experience in and around underemployment.
Interesting. Yeah. So one very interesting story that I read in the research paper, which I think a lot of us could relate to. This was a story about the 45-year-old gentleman from Dubai, and who was working as a CFO or a chief financial officer in a mid-sized firm in Dubai, and who, on immigrating to Canada, faced multiple barriers to finding meaningful employment. His professional credentials were not recognized, and although he did find a minimum wage in his industry, but he had to work as a security guard at nights to make ends meet. When such a thing happens, it definitely impacts the Canadian economy. Now, as a leader within the economic advisory practice at Deloitte, what do you think are the overall economic impact of underemployment that Canada has as a nation?
Yeah, that's a great question, Raj. Broadly speaking, around underemployment and sort of the economic impacts of it, or sort of lost, foregone opportunities, I would say. I think there's a few different dimensions to this. Productivity is a really big piece. When you think about underemployment and us speaking about individuals in the workforce that are not fully being tapped into, whether it's hours of work or skills, credentials that we're not fully tapping into, particularly in a time when we have very low unemployment rates. It's a tight labor market. It's challenging for employers to find the types of skills they need. It's really important to think about tapping into some of those sources, such as underemployed individuals. And productivity, which is really, how we produce, how efficiently we produce, is generally a challenge that's very widely documented in Canada, something that contributes to how we position ourselves when it comes to economic competitiveness globally. And it's something Canada tends to fall behind with relative to the U.S. or parts of Europe, Asia. And I think there's a clear, distinct connection here to underemployment. If we're able to identify individuals who could be contributing more to our workforce, such as the example you just mentioned, there certainly could be impacts to our productivity as a nation. Also, I think there are implications to income, of course, if we have individuals working more because they're able to put in more hours, if they're able to leverage higher forms of skills that they're not really using right now in their current role. That could suggest they could be earning more, of course, and that impacts household income. But then that also impacts our ability to spend and consume, and that has broad implications to the Canadian economy as well.
Yes, I think that's a very important point. I think consumer spending is always related to the growth of economy. And when consumers spend, the dollar actually reaches the manufacturer all the way down to the value chain. It benefits everybody, it benefits the economy grows. I think that's absolutely true. I just want to share a personal story. So I came to Canada 2 years ago, and as a newcomer to Canada, I firsthand experienced the barriers that one could face with regards to employment or finding meaningful employment. In my previous country, I was running the sales and marketing for a small tech firm, but I really had to go through a lot of challenges to find meaningful employment when I came here. What happened to me is that, to be honest, a family friend even advised me that why don't you go and take up a packing job at a warehouse, for survival. And I have no disrespect for packing jobs at the warehouse, just that my skills and training is not good. I'd be the worst packer in the world if I had taken that job, right? Probably got fired in 2 days. And I remember those days to be one of the most difficult times in my life. I was actually diagnosed borderline depressed, and my family life suffered. I remember one day my kid was telling me, "Dad, why are you not happy?" So I think this is not unique to me. A lot of people who come here who have to go through who come with decent work experience and skills have to go through this journey, and taking like survival jobs doesn't help because you're not able to bring your whole self to work, right? Now, did this phase of underemployment come about in your research? And what do you think are some of the overall societal impact of underemployment?
Yes, absolutely. Well, of course, one of the population segments that we looked at, I think, very extensively in our research was new Canadians being part of who's impacted by underemployment a great deal in the Greater Toronto Area, and of course would share, unfortunately, similar experiences or similar feelings as they went through that underemployment period, or of course still may be going through that. Social impacts, I think, are just as consequential as the economic side of things. As you described, at the individual level, somebody is feeling perhaps low self-esteem, low self-worth. They are experiencing this severe dissatisfaction with their job placement, but that permeates around them. It impacts their everyday life, those around them, their family, their friends, how they interact with others, and really their quality of life. And so that's really a big piece of it. I think it's all related also to the economic side, but social impact is absolutely part of the underemployment side of things.
What do you think can be done better in this? I mean, because there's a definite impact, how can we counter this a little better?
Yeah, great question. There are a range of solutions that, or I should say recommendations that we start to look at in our paper. Maybe I'll just take a step back and speak about the approach a little bit to our work, which led us to some of those recommendations. As I mentioned earlier, the work did include a broad literature review. We looked at a lot of global research and the definitions in and around underemployment. We looked to understand personas and case studies, as you've described, of individuals, how they experience underemployment, because they all have a very different story, a very unique story. So understanding those specific examples is important, I think, to understanding the issue itself. We did conduct a range of stakeholder consultations with many community organizations, employment agencies, because, of course, they're experiencing the challenges that are not where it's not being effective, I guess, some of the services perhaps. And right at the front line, what are some of the things we could do to help improve service delivery? So we incorporate a lot of that thinking into the paper, which was absolutely valuable. A range of recommendations, and I'd say there's probably a few things that apply broadly, first of all. I think building awareness is critical. There's a lot of lack of understanding around the topic. As I said, there's not a lot of good information out there, not a lot of good data. And so we need to understand the issue itself, and that's across the board. I think that's government, employers, and community organizations as well. Collaboration is key across all of these groups, government, community, and employers. I think the recommendations actually speak to all three groups, but in various ways. So collaboration and awareness are absolutely critical.
It's very interesting you say that, Anita, because when I read the report, I think one of the facts that kind of jumped at me was that underemployment costs the Canadian government anything between $13 to $17 billion a year. That's very, very significant, come to think of it. And you just mentioned that building awareness is key. You mentioned that there are stuff that government, employers, and community should be doing. I just wanted to probe a little more deeper into what you mean in terms of what do you think government, employers, and community, which are the key stakeholders in the battle against underemployment, what could they bring to table to counter and offer some solutions?
Yes, absolutely. Listening to the community organizations, employment agencies, we heard a lot about demand-driven wraparound services being a critical piece that we need to get a little bit better at. And what we mean by that is someone's journey in underemployment, of course, is case by case and varies across individuals, but it isn't just about accessing that first job that aligns with your interests full-time or whatever the case may be. It's also about supporting success after you've taken up that job. And there may be an interest in coaching or mentoring, accessing networking opportunities. There are potentially even social services that aren't necessarily provided right now that could help individuals, whether it's things around help with finding childcare or transportation support. Child literacy was something we heard about. Other support services that enable someone to focus on their gainful employment. And so those types of wraparound services are to be tailored by individuals, of course, but they also need certain support from government in particular. And that kind of leads to another recommendation on the government side, which is around funding mechanisms. We heard that a lot of programs are funded on an annual basis for 1 year. But this concept of wraparound services and helping someone not just find their job, but afterwards help support them be successful could easily take longer than that 1 year period. So can funding be provided for a longer term? Can it be more flexible? We've heard about the idea of public-private partnerships, and I'll come to employers in a second, but employers would and should be incented as well to play a role here because it's about them tapping into skills that they need, which we know it continues to be a challenge as well. And so there is certainly a role for government. Also on the government side, just data. I think if there's a way for some of our statistical agencies to study this a bit further, get an understanding of the data, who's experiencing underemployment, it helps us understand that issue much more. Like, what's the scale of it? We don't really have a good sense of that in Canada. On the employer side, I think there's a few different things to think about as well. Awareness, of course, is key, looking within the organization to understand if underemployment is a prevalent issue, and we are starting to see that some organizations are thinking this way, which is done through various mechanisms, whether it's surveying or workshopping within the organization to understand the existence of this. And then once you have that awareness, I think there's different ways to think about underemployment. Many organizations may not be thinking about it specifically right now, but we are seeing increasing importance placed on diversity and inclusion broadly as an area of importance. It's a priority. I experience this and see this at Deloitte a great deal. We care very much about diversity of thought in the workplace. We understand the value that it brings. Whether we're thinking through solutions for an organization, we know that that diversity of thinking will help us come to the best potential ideas on that topic. We want to connect with our consumers, our clients, our partners, our stakeholders, and to do that, we can't be homogenous. We have to have different representation, which connects into that population segment piece we chatted about, and that's connecting with new Canadians, it's connecting with women and Indigenous groups, all the different underrepresented or more vulnerable groups that experience underemployment.
I wanted to know, where was the origin of this research? How did you guys come up with this entire idea of doing this research?
Yes, absolutely. So World Class at Deloitte, it's essentially our focus on corporate responsibility. We think about where we can apply our skills as consultants broadly, whether it's working with some of our clients or otherwise partners, on issues that are really important to our broad society. And this, of course, is a great example of that type of topic, so we were very keen to work on it. The Greater Toronto Airport Authority was already thinking about this topic, Toronto Pearson. They had, I believe, surveyed within the organization to get a sense of underemployment and very closely thinking about the topic and probably ahead of the curve in that sense. So we combined forces and our community interests and put a team together. It was a really great collaborative effort. The team very much enjoyed working on this study, particularly partnering with the Greater Toronto Airport Authority, but also connecting with many of the agencies like yourself. I think it was very enlightening to us. We learned a great deal. And we're able to meet individuals that represented various aspects of underemployment. Whether you're experiencing underemployment, we did speak with individuals who had experienced it or were experiencing it, and perhaps realizing some improvement through the services support system. We, of course, spoke with people across the service organizations as well, and all of that really informed our study in a powerful way. Personally, I would connect, I think, to this as well, in the sense that while I am Canadian-born, I am Indian. My parents are from India. They are immigrants as well. They immigrated actually 3 times in their lifetime. They lived in Germany, then Brazil, and then came to Canada. And I certainly saw some of those challenges that they would have experienced in the workplace, and they did experience periods of underemployment. I think it's amazing to see where we've come today with the services that are available that certainly may not have been available previously, but also the fact that we are shedding so much light on important issues like this. D&I absolutely, but underemployment drilling into it because it is a very specific challenge. I think it's incredible that we're starting to give it this focus and think about how we really address it effectively.
Absolutely. It was wonderful having you here. Thank you for your time. It was a great discussion.
Thank you so much. Especially happy to be talking with you about this today, Raj, on behalf of Deloitte. We have a great partnership with TRIEC, and it's been wonderful to play a role on your various support services that you do provide to people who are underemployed, and certainly looking to expand on that and continue to support you in that way.
A really insightful conversation there with Anita. You can read the full report on the Deloitte website by searching Uncovering Underemployment. I've been your host, Raj Dam. Today's episode was produced by Andrea Thompson with production help from Rohit Singh.
And that was Business of Inclusion. You can tell us what you thought about this episode and what you want to hear from us next on Twitter at TRIEC, TRIEC, or on LinkedIn at Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council. Thanks for listening.